Welcome to Dungeon Brew. I am Josh, and this is my series on world building where I lead you through a collection of videos on how I build worlds for my tabletop role-playing games. So kick back, relax, and I'll see you on the other side of the intro. Salutations, my fellow primates. Today we are going to be sitting down and talking about how we define our game world, how we're going to start setting the foundation for a tabletop role-playing game campaign that we are beginning. Now, I really go through this process about every time that I start a brand new game, unless I'm just going to be running some sort of pre-made module that I've found that my players are really excited about. Or if I've sat down and had, a really immersive conversation with my players and they've decided that there's a particular type of campaign that they want me to run. But if I am just in my own creative space and I am developing something from scratch, this is where I begin. Now, I will kind of give the disclaimer that some of what I'm going to share in this video, I talk about at length in the narrative design series that is here on Dungeon Brew that my wife and I did in discussing how you develop games to make them immersive and exciting for your players. So for me, my process in starting a game that I'm building from scratch oftentimes starts in the same way of when I am writing a book, and that is in developing a theme for the story that is going to be told. Now, a theme, for those of you that are not aware of it, it's this objective literary device that's being utilized to teach a lesson or a truth that serves as the foundation overall for the story. And this can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. I'm sure that you've watched television shows or you've played video games or you've seen movies where there's very clear themes that are apparent throughout the storytelling that is taking place. And these are things like maybe a coming of age story or a good versus evil story, which are both fairly typical, I think, in even tabletop role-playing games. You have coming of age where you have like these young dreamers that are becoming epic heroes that are going through a series of events that is shaping them and molding them and developing them into the heroes that they're going to be. Or just that typical good versus evil. Individuals that are going out and righting the wrongs of the world or overcoming some sort of impending doom or darkness that is kind of spreading, your typical Lord of the Rings type of thing. So those are both fairly common themes that take place, but I also like to look at other themes to potentially introduce. And these are things like possibly like revenge stories, redemption stories, stories of perseverance, stories of power and corruption, which is one of my personal favorites, looking at the impact of war on societies and peoples and how that shapes generations, or even looking at something as more abstract and even argumentatively like a debatable topic between my players, which would be free will. But I like looking at what the theme of the story is going to be. What are little lessons that I want to interweave throughout the social interactions that they're having, what things that they might be able to interpret through their exploration that they do, or even things that are kind of solidified by the situations that they find themselves, even in terms of the combat that takes place. And so I take some time and I consider what themes do I want to have be reoccurring throughout the entire narrative of the story that we're going to be telling together. And I kind of like jot down a few. And like I said, good and evil is a pretty typical one that we pick. Even if you're running like an evil character campaign, you're just, the inverse of that, where you have evil characters that are fighting against good. But I just like that framework of how I'm going to start looking at everything that is being pieced together in the story. Sorry about that. My leg fell asleep and I had to readjust. So once you have decided on the theme or the themes that you want to use within your story, then I move to deciding what I want the tone or the genre to be. Now, for those of you that aren't aware, the tone is kind of like this subjective expression of what the theme is going to be. And oftentimes the GM themselves have like the ability to decide how they want that to unfold. Now, my players will ask me sometimes to play a certain type of game, like they'll want a high fantasy, high magic game, or they want a sword and sorcery, low magic game. And so I try to develop a game that has those elements in it. Now, John and I did a series on fantasy genres that you might want to include in your game or consider for your game, and we break down how to give them that particular type of feel for each one of them. But this is where I go to next. Once I know what the theme is, then I'm deciding, do I want it to be a grim dark, or do I want it to be noble dark? Do I want to have low or high magic, low or high fantasy? Do I want it to be steampunk or diesel punk? Recently I did a high fantasy Lovecraftian adventure in Neverwinter. And so one of the things that I did before I built that campaign is I sat down and I decided, okay, this is going to be high fantasy. So how many races or cultures do I want to have available in Neverwinter during the course of this game? And so I settled on, having the drow, having elves, dwarves, halflings. I had tieflings. I had shapeshifters, were-rats specifically. I had some changelings. I had some elementals. I had a whole variety of different races that were in that setting because I was running a high fantasy adventure. But I also made it Lovecraftian. So this means that I wanted to have dark elements that were also there. So I used like Monsters of the Multiverse out of 5e, and I pulled a lot of just bizarre creatures from that book that were like the things of nightmares to give it that feel for the setting that I wanted to develop. And while we had a lot of fun in that campaign, we actually just wrapped that up a couple weeks ago, I'm personally partial to grim, dark settings that specifically have low magic and low fantasy. I find those to be a lot of fun. Another game I just recently finished up yesterday, as a matter of fact, was a game that was based in the Hyborian Age with Conan. So it was a sword and sorcery epic campaign. And so I wanted to have this old world feel with these gritty maps and these monsters and these enemies that were not only embedded with this magic, but had this physical prowess that just made them unparalleled on the battlefield. And of course, Conan is set in the Iron Age, and so I had to rework some of the weapons and the armor and the magical items that existed to fit that campaign world. And as usual, I'm getting ahead of myself, but it had to do with how I developed this sword and sorcery epic campaign that had that feel to it. So again, I start with theme, and then I move into my tone or my genre, and then after that I look at how I can set the mood for the campaign. So these are, again, the three areas I start with. And the third one is mood. And this is the emotional atmosphere that I am trying to create that's going to be produced by that tone. Sword and sorcery has a different feel than grimdark. Lovecraftian has a different feel than, a space opera, a sci-fi space opera. And so I want to make sure that I am looking at how I can develop this world. So if I'm creating a good versus evil theme that's in a diesel punk world, what does that look like? And how does that differ from having a power and corruption theme that's taking place in maybe a high noble dark fantasy setting? How does coming of age in a low magic sci-fi space opera, differ from both of those? And so I start to put this combination together in my head and think about, how do I pull out the elements of this specifically in this world to make it memorable for my players and give them a sense of investment into it? And I may steer away from the building process a little bit and start doing things that are an inspiration to kind of get me on the right track. So maybe I'll listen to some music that will kind of capture that muse of the setting for me, or I'll look at some images that inspire me. Maybe I'll just go sit down and watch a movie or two that kind of fit within that world, to kind of see what the director did in order to give that theatrical feel to the movie, to immerse folks in watching that. That just kind of comes from my college days, because we used to have to do that for one of my classes, and watching movies and see what directors did specifically to give it, and based on color and feel and music and pacing. And I might actually even open up my handy dandy, I got it over here next to me, lore book, and start writing down some particular phrases or language that I would want to use that, again, pulls out a a certain feel in the world. If I have my nobles or my merchants speaking in certain broken languages or in accents or using specific words that give a particular feel to my players, I want to jot those down and think about them so I can incorporate them into the story later when I start building that to make it more realistic for them. I imagine for many people at this point that are watching the video, if you've made it this far going, that all sounds like a lot of work and very crazy, and I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. But it is one of the things that I love most about playing TTRPGs is that story. And I feel like I should probably add in here that I also think about what motifs kind of fit my muse. If I'm running a sci-fi campaign and it's a coming of age, is it like Ender's Game? If I'm running, a dark high fantasy or even a dark low fantasy, am I looking at Lord of the Rings? Am I looking at Game of Thrones? If I'm wanting something gritty, does it have something to do like Conan? Am I looking at Spartans from 300 if I'm doing something more historical? So I start to look at motifs that might fit that muse, and those are things that I may seek out and explore in order to embed myself into that creative space to allow me to develop something that has that same feel. All right, let me go get some water and then we will continue. The next thing that I consider is the core aesthetic. How am I going to balance the 3 tiers of gameplay in my game to express the tone and genre that I am setting up for my players? So this has to do with things that John and I have talked about before. We're looking at the tiers of combat, social encounters, and exploration. And in my personal perspective, when you are playing a particular type of game, they lend themselves towards more tiers than others. For instance, if I'm going to be playing an epic high fantasy, there's a chance I'm going to have quite a bit of combat that's going to be taking place in that game, more so than if I was playing like a low fantasy, low magic campaign that was centralized around power and corruption. That might have more social encounters. Or if I am running a sword and sorcery in an open world at a young age, like let's say in age relative to like the Bronze Age, there might be more exploration in that particular campaign. But I essentially take these 3 tiers and I put a percentage down next to them for how much I plan to utilize them while developing my game to explore my theme. And they should add up to 100% the accumulation of the 3. Now, I'm partial towards social encounters. If you've been in one of my games before, my players know that I usually have more social than I do with exploration and combat, typically 50 or 60, and then I break up the other 2 between 20-25% for each one of them. But you may be more partial to combat or more partial to exploration. Now, once I've decided that, and I'll be honest, by the time we've gotten to this point, so we've looked at our theme, we've looked at our tone or our genre, we've looked at our mood, and we've looked at the aesthetic. I've taken some notes that are already probably pretty well defined in my little book of maybe some plots and subplots and maybe want the BBEG to be what I'm wanting to do. Like I'm taking notes during all of this and brainstorming about what type of story I want to tell. But once I have gotten to this point, the next thing that I dive into is considering what I want the core mechanic to be. Do I want to use Castles and Crusades? Do I want to use 5e Dungeons and Dragons or 3.5 Dungeons and Dragons? I just hit my keyboard. What is it that I want to necessarily use? And does it complement the story that I want to tell, or do I need to make adjustments to the rules to, again, reinforce the mood and the atmosphere that I am trying to set for my players? And I've made some adjustments over the years. Like I mentioned earlier, I like grim, dark stories. I like dark fantasy stories, and so it's not uncommon for me to utilize specific rules that John has created primarily, or ones that I have developed over time that kind of help me match that same type of atmosphere that I like to play in or that I like to GM in. So there's like crit and fumble tables that John has worked on and developed that are a lot of fun. There's also injury charts that he has created and insanity charts that he's created that I really like to incorporate in my games because they give that gritty feel. And so oftentimes I'll add those to the rule set. I've also made changes in like how attacks of opportunities work. I'll borrow things from earlier editions and place them into newer editions because I feel like it gives more of an epic or heroic feel, and so I'll consider adding those in. I will also create factions, and I'll give players bonuses for being parts of those factions, which I think lends itself well to like sword and sorcery. If I have a high or low fantasy game, I might adjust how many spells you get or what schools of magic you have access to, because I want it to reflect that. That's actually going to be coming up in our campaign that we're going to be running for the 9th Ascension. There's a very different type of magic system that's being utilized, and so the spellcasters have access to different spells than what you typically think that they would. I might also include like reputation rules for more social tiered games and have different DC checks based on what your reputation is with the individuals that you're engaging with. I also like to sometimes make healing potions be a bonus action that can be utilized during combat, especially for like epic fantasy games again. Or one time we were playing a Nordic campaign, and it was supposed to be this just really desolate, like dark, again, grim, dark type of setting and campaign. And so I built up exhaustion rules to be impact characters anytime they slept less than 8 hours, which increased the chances of that occurring when they were sleeping out in the wilderness. And so I built different mechanics to kind of reflect and complement the story that I was trying to tell, so that there was that feeling as you were going through the game that you really were living that experience. And so I don't like any of these things I've talked about. These are all things that I'm jotting down. They're notes that I am making in my book, and trying to build up this type of concept of what I will be creating. And they're all subject to change. Like I like to think of this as an ongoing outline during this world building process that I use. The last thing that I want to discuss before we call this video quits is how to create a unique story. And while this is an ongoing process and something we'll be talking about more in depth, I've made mention that during this brainstorming process that I'm going through, I'm taking down a lot of notes in my little black lore book about what type of story I might want to tell and how I'm going to execute that. And one of the things that I include in that is some notes that kind of like fill out into this 3-act structure of what my story is going to represent. A number of years ago, I wrote a book on how to write a book in 30 days. And although you're not writing a book here, the framework of telling a great story that you're going to be telling with the players is going to have the same like rise and fall that you would see in a 3-act structure, hopefully. And I do want to give the caveat that you are going to be telling a story shared with the other players around the table. So although you're writing an outline and some notes of what you are thinking about including here, that may change and be adjusted once you bring your players to the table to start telling the story and they make decisions that send you into different directions. So I want to just talk a little bit about the 3-act structure. And again, this is just like what I'm putting down when I'm brainstorming. So the first act is usually about the setup of the story. This is where you're introducing the heroes, you're setting up the plot, you're giving a good feel for what the theme is that you've chosen to have, and you're kind of beginning with this simple call to action that hints at what the larger story is going to be. So those things should be included in those first few sessions that you're doing. You're introducing the player, the antagonist, the world. There should be a moment for them to discover who they are. I mean, your players are going to discover their personalities and their motivations. There should be a moment of defeating some type of enemy that helps them feel more heroic and as though they've achieved something great. You should have an area where you're like just throwing down some minor goals that you want them to accomplish. Maybe not overthrowing the king, but overthrowing a bandit nearby. And it should be a time for them like to collect magical relics. So I'm taking down little notes of like what should be happening in that first act that I want to make sure that I capture. There should be little breadcrumbs just given to like what the politics are like, what the religion's like, how commerce works, all these little things that make the world feel more real. And so I'm going to be jotting down ideas that are kind of just like coming to me during the process of brainstorming. You don't want to get into Act 3 and then suddenly be like, oh, by the way, guys, you're underneath a republic and they are now pushing this law down on top of you that's going to impact the entire game. Like, that's just railroading them. So you want to make sure that in your first act, there's breadcrumbs to all these things that you're including. In your second act, this is where you start to have whatever the conflict is become more complicated. Players should have to start reacting more than being prepared for the events that are coming about. They should have to adapt to circumstances in some way. There's some surprises that are going to arrive on their doorstep. It moves from a feel-good to like a dark night of the soul moment where things start to feel more time sensitive and they are overbearing, and the player characters start having revelations that are a little jaw-dropping. And so you're going to include things that are shocking to the characters. These are things you would typically see in a second act, like suddenly killing off an ally, or maybe even a character dies, or you have a new fact that comes to light that realizes a lot that the things that you considered during the first act were not all that they seemed. Or maybe a new character is introduced that kind of shifts things sideways and realize that maybe we were on the wrong side of things. Whatever it is, it's some sort of twist that you put into the story that gives the characters a moment of pause and thinking about where they're going and what they're doing. And so as I'm brainstorming again, I'll put some ideas down like these of what might I throw out here in the second act to really challenge my players based on the type of story that I'm telling. If I'm in a high magic campaign, what happens when they go into a setting that has anti-magic and they've prepared themselves with all these magical items and now they have to fight an enemy that doesn't that they're not able to use these against? That can be really fun and really challenging, and it's specific to the genre or to the theme. And then lastly, the third act, remembering to jot down some ideas about this. What is that final battle with the BBEG going to look like? How am I going to close character arcs and make sure they come to completion? At the third act, the hero should have a plan moving forward. The tension should be building to this finale that's happening. There should be some glimmer of hope in terms of them like feeling like they're going to overcome it or be able to get things done, and all the loose ends should be tied up. And I like to remind myself of those things as I'm brainstorming and coming up with all these great ideas in the beginning of the first act and second act, or things that I want to include in my story, because if I have too many tendrils going in all directions, I may not be able to pull them all back in to have the full campaign feel like it's come to completion. And so some things that you may do in that final act is make sure that you're thinking of a memorable location or a memorable ability. You might give your BBEG, but before I start building my world, I want to think about, hey, what are some really awesome locations I want to have here for that final fight that I'm going to show to the characters? Maybe I want to plan for like a battlefield alteration. Maybe there's an area that is shifting between planes, and that's where I want my final battle to be. And so I want to make sure that I create an atmosphere or a world that lays the right mechanics in place to allow this maybe a floating moat that they have to go on that's shifting between planes that they're having to fight the final bad guy on, whatever it may be. Or maybe I want to have metamorphosis occur with different characters or creatures, or even the final bad guy if they fight that final campaign, that makes it that much more epic. And how am I going to build a world that allows me to have that type of magical energy or process take place? And so I'm thinking about, how am I building up all these different acts? Where might I want to have it located at? And all these little elements before I start getting into the nitty-gritty of building my world, because I want to make sure that the world that I build, the cultures I build, the gods that I have or don't have within my world, that everything allows for the story that I want to tell. So that is my initial process in beginning the world building process. My initial process for going through the process. This is how I start in building a world for a campaign, is considering all these aspects and brainstorming before I really dive into it. So I hope this has been helpful for you. Next week, we are going to be talking about building pantheons and what should be included in a pantheon if you're building it. So by all means, please hit the like, subscribe button and the bell. Leave me a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.
Judge and Crew.